Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy, I'm a writer, and this is an educational YouTube series intended to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversation with other writers. Jonathan Eburne is a professor of comparative literature, English, and French and Francophone studies at Penn State. He is the author of several books, including Exploded Views, Speculative Form, and The Labor of Inquiry, forthcoming from the University of Minnesota Press. Outsider Theory, Intellectual Histories of Unorthodox Ideas, published in 2018, which received the James Russell Lowell Prize from the Modern Language Association. And Surrealism and the Art of Crime, also published in 2018. Eburne is founding co-editor with Amy J. Elias and former editor-in-chief of the ASAP Journal, and a founder and past president of the International Society for the Study of Surrealism. He is also part of the organizing team for a nonprofit bookstore and culture space in central Pennsylvania called The Print Factory. And this is my conversation with Jonathan. Hi, how are you?
Okay, good morning. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. So what are you working on now, and what motivated the project or projects?
So I'm kind of in a transitional point at this very moment because I am finishing the index for a book that's coming out in March called Exploded Views, which is a self-reflexive book of scholarship where I write in two different voices. So I took old, it's a very COVID project. I took old writing that had been abandoned or unfinished or not yet finished, including writing about the Print Factory, which is a bookstore project that I'm involved in Belfont, which for years was underway but not complete. And so I took all this writing that was kind of broken and broke it more. I broke it wide open. So I wrote this other narrative or narratives about the process of working on them, what interrupted them, what motivated them. Because like an exploded view diagram, I wanted to show how all the bits fit together or didn't fit together. So that that's a project we can talk more about. It was very reflexive, kind of a COVID project. I couldn't go out and do heroic research, swinging from tree to tree in the archive looking for shiny magical objects. So I concentrated on process, and I've been talking like you to other people on Zoom, artists and people I really enjoy speaking with, and I was just one kind of in awe always of how fascinating their sense of their own process was. And so I use that to go through my desk and find various things that I wrote. And it was also a very good way of dealing with students and their kind of increasingly multiplied concerns during and after COVID too, because people have a lot going on. And a lot of times the material pressures, the sheer expense of going to college, especially at a place like Penn State, the idea that there's a vocational pressure that has to be so wholly embodied in order to offset the expense of going in the first place means that people are always distracted by something. And so this kind of writing, very reflexive, it's not just a way to position oneself, but also to really handle and think about those worldly pressures and the way that they change shape, impact, distort, but sometimes also mobilize the work of ideas. So that's something that I have been working on. And then I'll just mention that another thing that is just not quite finished, but it was really influential to me. I've been collaborating for several years with a theater director named Stacy Klein, who is the founding director of Double Edge Theater up in Massachusetts. It's a feminist. It was founded as a feminist theater. It's now this kind of year-round whole ecology of performance training, environmental work, land back, social justice work, and her working with her to edit her 40 years worth of writings, many of which are for the company of the actors and artists involved in this group, has been so powerful in thinking about organizing and collectivizing and questions about why we do what we do when we write, why we do what we do when we work in culture, how meaningful it is, but how how much work it is. And so that's really kept a lot of vibrancy in my own thinking. It's been really inspiring. So these are projects that are, again, they're sort of done-ish. So I'm not looking in the horizon about working on them, but they're still very much on my desk. I could go on, but I will leave it at those for the moment.
That's amazing. I can't wait to read all of those projects. I'm really interested in fracture as someone from
Hmm.
Appalachia, especially from West Virginia, because you always sit somewhere in the middle. You're not quite Southern, you're not quite part of the Northern reality. So you sort of sit in this fractured space. So I'm really interested in anything that has fracture surrounding
Cool.
it and absolutely labor. Labor poetry is one of the things that brought me into the discipline. So these are projects I'm really excited to see.
No, thank you. And they're both very much about the driving question of when is labor your labor, or when is it the labor of never giving up, the labor of struggle, the labor of the kind of capital W work. That's the work that you want to devote yourself to, and how much can you ever extract it or remove it or purify it from the labor that is being extracted from you by something else. And I mean, I'm interested in I've written about workaholism. I think it's almost a kind of supreme condition people who have the great privilege of being workaholics can kind of tolerate. But it's a vexed and important question, and I think it has so much going on, especially in where we live, and thinking about the history of where we live in Appalachia with extractive industry, and then thinking about the university system as this kind of parasitical, in the best way, perhaps, parasitical formation on top of that, which kind of redoubles and trains anew these intellectual relationships to that same, extractive question. It's something.
I love that. I love that sort of parallelism and that sense of fusing and connecting them as well. And I think that even shows up in the way that contracts exist in academia. So,
Mm.
contingent labor is on the rise.
Yes.
Not every contingent position is eligible for benefits, but you'll be doing most of the teaching labor.
It's right out there for everybody to see, but without organized resistance, which is happening, but without organized resistance, the fact that it's baldly visible doesn't sort of make it naturally go away. There's nothing natural about there's no natural course of things in capitalism. So it without working very hard to remediate that, it will just continue indefinitely. Yeah.
There's so much literature around unionization
Hmm.
in different sort of realities. So what I know most about is the West Virginia mine wars and
Yes.
labor action that took place during, like the early 1900s and those kinds of strikes and those kinds of very real public displays. And these kinds of public displays could potentially get you thrown in the coke oven.
Yeah, and I guess not to make put too fine a point on it, but having watched the Harlan County, USA documentary, it made me wonder, or it makes me think that in a very removed way from certain kinds of labor struggle. I'm not going to try to put a working class aesthetic onto my own scholarly work, but that said, I was really interested in trying to think about what are the actual are there elements of scholarly writing in the humanities, like actual scholarly writing, that can somehow accommodate themselves or lend themselves or reflect the work of solidarity, collectivization, or is it really just, is the remove in social practice met or corresponding to a remove in style? I don't know the answer to that necessarily, but I was really thinking about it. What is it? Is there something that like scholarship has to give? Not just the ideas, but the actual writing of it, the sort of filigree of almost excessive writing. And you mentioned fractures, and I think that's really interesting. And as we're talking, I think it has something to do with attention in the same way that a documentary like Harlan County has to have a kind of a jittery camera. The more things the camera sees, the camera actually works best by not paying attention. The more things it sees, the more elements, the more detailed and the more full the viewpoint can be about what are the very many factors that are involved in organizing, people's affects, people's lives, the things that people don't even necessarily call up all the time, resistance to the idea, but then also the forces that they're working against. And so somehow the camera that's sort of a bit furtive and even distracted is actually an incredible tool for that kind of documentation. And I was experimenting, you might say, in ways in which that kind of distraction in writing might be recuperatable somehow as a form of consciousness, let's say.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. I love that. So anything that starts mimicking craft, content sort of mimicking the craft, or the craft kind of
Mm.
mimicking the content to reinforce each other, to create not just delivering the story, but creating an experience with that, right?
Yes. Yes. That's good. Right. Absolutely.
So, what have you learned about yourself through scholarly writing or research writing, the research processes?
I'm going to start early. A friend of mine, really good friend of mine, named Jeremy Braddock, who's another scholar, sort of a wonderful book about the radio comedians who made records called these folks here, the Firesign Theater. So they're a theater company, but they performed on record. Anyway, he wrote a wonderful book about that, and he pointed out something that other people have pointed out before, that all scholarship, the project of scholarship, whatever project a scholar devotes themselves to for years, tends to be autobiographical in some way, maybe in a disguised way. The insight isn't necessarily earth-shattering, although it's what's often fun is to figure out how something is autobiographical. So sometimes it's something that one is afraid of, or sometimes something that one's very far away from. So I started up my scholarship writing about surrealism and crime, experimental art movement, poetry movement, and their relationship to sensationalized but very real violent activity in the here and now. And it ended up being a book about politics, and that was something that seemed very far away from me. I consider myself to be hopelessly bourgeois, kind of, anxiously invested in a kind of bourgeois naivete. Or what have I ever done? And this was a kind of educational learning curve, just to think, wow, these people are responding in this way, and maybe not always the right way. Didn't do everything perfectly, but they're really, really conversing. This group of poets and artists thinking through their own positions. They had even this kind of self-investigation collectively about their positions on sexuality. Oftentimes, again, some of them are hopelessly, locked in the dark ages, but still they were thinking about these things and reflecting on them. And I just found that to be very, yeah, autobiographical in the sense of a kind of measuring oneself against some sort of future potential or some sort of desire or some sort of tendency. So that's something I made very explicit in the Exploded Views. What am I doing here? And the final chapter of that book is called "What Will You Make?" And it was started as the way I was thinking about writing a bookstore into existence, which now I can say, okay, we have this organization in Belfont, collectively run, volunteer, nonprofit bookstore and culture space that actually doesn't not exist. It actually it's happening. But for years, I was writing about the idea of writing about this and realizing in writing form that I couldn't just write it into existence. You can't just say, I'm going to go do this. But there's something beautiful about procedural prose. I walked into the room, I picked up a glass, I poured water into it. There's a way in which you can think in writing through a kind of set of processes, make them very concrete and real, but I was confronting this idea that writing it doesn't make it so. No surprises there. So what became interesting though was to follow up and to match the writing with these sort of actions. So that's my long answer, but the ways in which there's a kind of this autobiographical, surprisingly autobiographical component, or where you can rather do something very obviously autobiographical, but still find the surprise within it.
So, what's the role or responsibility of scholarship or scholarly writing for you? What keeps you generating material? Why do scholarship? Why write?
Oh, I mentioned surrealism, and the Parisian surrealist group in the 20s actually had a survey. They were very fond of these inquiries, and one of them was, why write? And the answers were really interesting. One of them was to prune life like a tree. You cut off the limbs that some limbs to keep others. One of the other answers that I've held on to is I write to meet other people. I like that idea. I'm not sure, and I've used it as my own with that very little anecdote around it for a long time. Unsurprisingly, I've come to question what my writing is for or whom it's for. And and then I stopped caring. It's for me, first and foremost. Now, there's scholarship more on other people in a second, but the writing part doesn't I have tremendous privilege. I get paid, I'm a tenured faculty member. Putatively, I get paid to do this writing in the humanities. That's my output. So the idea of making it not for something else, not for an instrument, not as a kind of professional widget that I produce on an assembly line or something, is actually available to me in a way that I'm really grateful for. But it's also strangely cognitively kind of hard to extract it away from that sense. Well, if I write another one, I'll get some more of it or whatever it is. But so going back to what we were just saying a moment ago, the idea that the writing is a kind of process that works like a kind of machine for reflecting, for thinking through something, for really getting into it, really tying myself up in knots about a project and questioning why am I doing this, asking questions like you just asked. I feel like that's really important because I have, where should I devote my attention? If the writing is where it all goes, that's a pretty bottomless pit. But if the writing is a kind of machine, even a Gordian knot for interrogating how to organize all that labor and stick it somewhere else, I feel like that's a lot different. That's a very tangled way of explaining it, but I've thought a lot about it. But it really is about gathering all of this, energy, research, attention, and kind of pushing it to some direction. And the question is, what is that direction? For me, it's been here in our town, working with other folks, collaborating, creating a space. And that's my other answer. So scholarship is like a dome or a bubble. Scholarship opens up the work of scholarship, which is coextensive with the work of teaching, is to gather a bunch of resources, investigations, infrastructures, and to create a kind of vessel in which people can spend time. Come into these ideas, think about them, and convene under under the dome of this idea. And I think that's, for me, a gracious and accommodating sense of what scholarship can be.
So the act of writing is just the beginning. It doesn't just stop at the page. It builds out, and the page creates a kind of instruction manual that says this is how we make things happen in our community. So then we get a practical application which goes so much further. It makes you feel as if it isn't so distant from you, that this is a part of your own being, that this is how you make things happen and affect change in your community in real time.
That's beautifully said. I agree fully with that. And so thank you for putting it that way. This idea of an instruction manual is wonderful because it suggests that there's always that work being done on the other side of the writing, even if the writing is difficult. And sometimes even especially if the writing's difficult, the idea of having to go in and be very conscious about how you're following the instructions, or your mind wanders and you don't follow the instructions, but you make up your own. I mean, all of those kinds of engagements, which go back to some basic ideas about how readers respond to text and what's the nature of interpretation. But they're still based on drawing out these actions and feelings and thoughts in the world very much after something has been written. So, yes, exactly what you said.
When you're struggling in research or writing for whatever reason, what strategies do you use to get yourself back to the page?
Well, there are two things I can say, and I'd love to hear your answer as well. Something that really made itself available in the COVID era is Zoom. So I have had several friends that I Zoom with, and we have writing time together. People have discovered this is not anything radical, but I think it's much like saying writing in pen is good. The so I'm meeting with a friend, ideally on a weekly basis, but not necessarily. There's always something coming up. But to spend the time together, doing a little Pomodoro session, perhaps for 25 minutes even, but with a conversation before and after to make that not a lonely practice, but a kind of together practice has been so illuminating and so lovely, regardless of what the writing is, whether it's for a continuing project or something random and something new, it doesn't matter. But just to use that to take it out of the space of loneliness and isolation. And I've carried that over and to thinking about writing with people in a coffee shop or let's say a bookstore. That's great too. So setting it up, having it not be isolated if possible, that's been really inspiring. One of the friends I write with is an artist and actor and a clown, in fact. And one of the times we were doing this, they suggested that we do some kind of calisthenic, like actually get our bodies, think about our bodies as we write, not just as this inert sitting, carcass, but really as what happens, what does it feel like to inhabit your own physicality and its limits and possibilities as you write. So we did deep knee bends and breathing and so forth. And then the kind of writing that came out after that was very different. It was a very different feeling. So that whole kind of interaction is one of the things that I can go to now. When I was in my 20s, I got stuck. I got really in my head about, am I writing the right kind of thing for the right sort of, will this work? Will I finish? Is this the right beginning for this amazing novel? I got up my own backside that way. And something about having an interlocutor and thinking about the mechanical, almost very particular idea of making pages as being very useful. The other thing is that I write in write in longhand. I got a little notebooks, and just scratch things out. It just doubles down on that idea of just put things on pages. Don't think about it too much. Don't worry if it's connected to something. And I try to do that a lot. And I find that when I'm writing well, there's just a proliferation of little books. And so I can go back to them when I'm struggling and just, continue on or read through or find a place where there's nothing blank. My two answers. But yeah, how do you do it?
I think that I share a lot of the same practices that you do. So that conversation is really important for me. And that's one of the reasons I started conversations with writers, is because now I've got a formal setup and an expectation going in. Here are the kinds of things we're going to talk about. And I can get really good strategies and ideas from other people, try those out. I've found them really successful. I've had a lot of publication success since I started conversations with writers because of the strategies that others are giving me and the other
Right.
ideas that I'm getting from these conversations. And while we may be having a conversation about their work, I'm also thinking about how I can apply those to the things that I'm working on. Like there's a series of short stories that I'm working on that center around an Appalachian granny witch around the time of the West Virginia mine wars. And one of those pieces has already been picked up. It's called Granny Witch and the Dead Rabbit, deals with abortion. And I'm putting her in situations. That's how I'm making it manageable for each
Oh, great.
story. So
Yes.
I run her through a specific situation. So she's got, dealing with an abortion. Then I think she's going to deal with a premature birth and she'll have to find water for her community. And so I'm going to run her through all of these situations to make the stories manageable in a given page space and then collect all those stories together to create a larger narrative sequence. I'm also working on a collection of poems that deal with the collapse of the Silver Bridge, where I'm from. So the anniversary will be on December 15th of that. So that's taking, both of these projects are taking quite a bit of research and then to sort of supplement whatever comes. And these conversations really help with that. And then if I'm still really struggling, a lot of times I'll just list. I'll just list whatever I can, all anything that's related to my senses. What do I hear, smell, taste, touch? What does a character hear, smell, taste, touch? What are their fears? What are their wants? What do they look like? What are their mannerisms? Do they have any quirks? Anything like that. Basic listing if I'm still struggling. And then a lot of the times, what I can do is take a lot of that data that I've just generated and start manipulating it into something that seems lifelike. So these are some of the strategies that I use. One really good sensory tip that Dr. Emily Zarka gave me was when she writes, she lights a specific candle. So now she's got an outside sense that says, okay, this is my writing time. This is the scent that smells like
Mhm.
writing for me.
That's fascinating. The the notion of running your character through situations is very close to me. It's how I thought of the the scholarly writing, but it also works very well with fictional. I think that's how I hang on to fictional work too, because I got really hung up on the idea of what is a story. Can you tell it? Can I tell a story? Can I get the right information? But this idea of like a problem solving endeavor is really close to me. I have a friend who's an artist and an animator. His name is Brent Green, and he once said this hypothetical that really encapsulates what you just described is, uh, how would you make a zip line to the moon? The proposition is outlandish, but it's the running the how do you run through the situation? Okay, so you need he's first thing we need a there need to be a track because the moon orbits, so you need to have a non-static place. So there'd be a belt going around, with the one end of the zip line to go around. This idea of how do you run a character through situations means that you're really thinking about the kind of sensory, but also problem solving kind of groundedness, right? What are the decisions to be made? What are the tools that one needs? Like a little bit of Robinson Crusoe without the colonialism.
Exactly. And that helps stay within a reasonable page space
Hmm.
because a lot of this is still while we're writers and we expect to be reading, but a lot of this is going into digital spaces. They're publishing in digital spaces. So you really
Right.
have to think about what your audience is going to sit through. And the reality is that our attention span is much more finite. So the quicker I can get to the end of that story, the better. So I have to think about what is the minimum that I need to accomplish this story effectively. And that's one of the challenges that I kind of grapple with. And I think the poetry background that I have really helps me navigate.
I haven't really thought about the medium at all. It's funny, I still default very much to print as my sense of the medium, but you're totally right. The necessary economy of digital writing for sure. Especially now that a lot of the clickbait stories we get when we open our browser are measured in terms of how long they estimate it'll take you to read. And if it ain't happening in 6 minutes, probably ain't happening at all. So yeah, that's very wise. It's very wise.
Yeah, the medium in which we write and the way in which we publish has been
Mhm.
kind of something I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially since when I left academia, I briefly worked for a marketing and web design
Mm.
company for a while, and I was writing for them like blogs and stuff, and so then that got me thinking about the connections with creative writing and the expectations in this shift that we're moving toward, right? Because a lot of the stuff that you send is submitted digitally and then published digitally too.
Yeah. I mean, that's the one area perhaps in another conversation we can go further into because the so much about I think the existential dread of writing comes from the publishing question or the output question. And whether this is students writing in a class with the sense of which I'm just putting this through, under the transom of a professor's consciousness. And that's just that sort of depressing singularity of cause and effect. I do this, I get this grade, or the sort of crazy unknowns about the publishing industry whereby you're going to face 1,000 rejections and you better arm yourself against the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or I think there's so much mythos and shadowy regions of doubt and confusion within that area that really hovers over so much of the prospect of making writing that demystifying that, or at least separating them from the separating it from the process, is something very beautiful. So keen to hear your thoughts at a later date about all that.
What is your favorite part of the writing or research process and why?
I often think of myself as a juggler with shiny, very shiny things, like juggling fire. And I love the fire when it's going up, when the ball is going up, the fire is going up in the air. Oh, it's so joyful. Look at this new idea. It's so shiny, light's coming out of it. It's great. And then there's a point at which it hits its, apex and it starts to come down, and it's no longer so shiny. It's turned into labor. And and then the sort of the responsibility of catching it and then recycling it and getting it back up there. So for the longest time, I felt that that was that was the picture. That I got really excited by new ideas. Oh, I did this about this. It's gonna be so great. Oh, and then at a certain point, oh God, I gotta actually do the thing. Or at whatever point it becomes kind of drudgery. You have 25 pages of something that maybe end up being 70 or 50, and then you just have to gut out the last part. But I've started to realize how much excitement there is from the, let's say in the juggling metaphor, this hand. So the ball, the fire goes up, very shiny, new idea comes down as work, but then magically, almost through a little bit of labor that is almost sleight of hand, you turn it back into fire, and it goes back up again, shiny. And so that moment of like having worked something through, having gone through, the slough of despond and thinking, oh God, I'll never do it. I'm not sure if you remember your Sesame Street at all, but there was this guy, the Don Music, the guy that would try to make up the nursery rhyme songs and then bang his head on the piano in frustration, working through that and suddenly finding the energy anew, that you're like, oh, I like this again, or that you kind of resurrect it, and there's the phoenix comes out of the ash. That moment is that's everything. Ideas are cheap. They're, throwing up the first ball in the air. Anybody can pretty much do that. There's a way to launch a ball, just, whatever force. But then to recycle it, to take it after that labor transformation and transform it back into excitement. Yeah, that's where it is. And to do that several turns, right, in a project is I think where the power, where the real force of the work can come from.
What revision strategy or strategies do you find most useful when revising your own work and why? What sort of problems or challenges do these activities help you solve?
I have the worst memory. I'm terrible. My memory is, well, it's not absolutely a blank. I'm a big fan of the writer and artist Leonora Carrington, who's kind of big these days. But one of her characters talked about having the faculty of miscellaneous recall. So things just bubble up. But one of the things that this makes available to me is reading my own work as if it were the work of somebody else, a kind of defamiliarization effect. So I always print it out. Anything on the computer, print it out, print it out. I use recycled paper, so I feel. But I burn a lot of. I use a lot of printouts. I try to write in longhand, so the typing it in is a revision already. So every time it's seen anew, take that very literally, to revise is to see something again. Again, I've forgotten what it was, or like it's as if I've forgotten. Trying to look at it anew, but just seeing it on the page, not on the screen, on the page. Such a dumb basic idea, but it is so fundamental to to me. And there's not much else to it other than that. Just to I have the again the capacity, the faculty of miscellaneous recall to remember that it's not mine. So not to see it as like with that stitched together sense of intrinsic, this is mine, but rather as what's this person getting at? And then just to really just being able to see it on the page. Very simple. But the more hits, the better, right? Just trying to like fool yourself to get as many sets of eyes on it as possible, even when those sets are one's own.
And what reading suggestions do you have? What scholars and or creative writers do you keep in your back pocket?
The back pocket. Okay, so I mentioned Leonora Carrington, and I'm looking at her. I have her books right there on my shelf to my right as I'm looking the right at eye level. I think The Hearing Trumpet is one of the most magical books ever written. It's a tall tale. The book on tape is spectacular. I listened to the performance by Sean Phillips, the Irish actor, and she's so good. And you realize, oh, this is a story to be read aloud. Anyway, that's one of the most magical and like wackadoodle stories. Some moments of incredible profundity as well. It's got a book inside a book. It's absolutely brilliant. So I just think about that, and also how the author, it was written in maybe the early 50s and it wasn't published to the 70s. So one of the books I admire most was carried around by the author for over 25 years. I mean, it wasn't published. And it was only when another book got published. No, that was the other way around. Her earlier book didn't get published till after. So she was carrying around two novels, having published with the Surrealists, having published short stories and stuff, and being a really well-known painter. She had these two novels just sitting around for years and years and years. That part of it also stays with me. So that's one thing. The other book I have in my pocket always is Karl Čapek's, the Czech author Karl Čapek's book, The War with the Newts. This is the same author that did RUR, the Rossum's Universal Robots, but this is one about, yeah, salamanders, this sort of species of salamanders. And it's this speculative fiction that's really apocalyptic and dystopian and very convincing. That could be an allegory for communism, could be an allegory for capitalism, it could be an allegory for fascism, for colonialism. It's all of the above. It's absolutely wonderful and written in a very kind of almost humorous tone, but even though it's apocalyptic. And then the book that I've been reading that really appeals to me for reasons that are hands-on is Kimberly Kinder's scholarly book. It's a book of sociology called The Radical Bookshop, a counter space for social movements. And it's about bookshops, radical bookstores, and how they exist on main streets in the world of commerce and capitalism. So they're not obeying the same, they're complicated, and they're more complicated than simply the almost purity of a social movement, but they enable it. And so it's really working through those complexities. And I found that book to be both inspiring and very smart about articulating those creations of space, like, like we were saying with how research and scholarship can create a kind of dome. This is about brick and mortar sites of that same kind of work. So I find that book wonderful too.
Thank you so much for those reading suggestions. I can't wait to check them out. And thank you so much for making time for me. I have learned so much.
Oh, well, likewise, Andy. I such a delight talking with you, and I'd love to turn the tables and hear your initial answers to these, but your follow-up points are really beautiful, and I was finding great moments of you know commonality between our thinking. So that's just a delight. Thank you so much for thinking of me with this. I really do. I'm really honored, but it's also just a real pleasure to talk with you.